Welcome back, everybody, to English 247. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 29th. So first, to begin with some class updates, if you submitted in paper number 1 on time, I've returned it to you. So if you haven't received it, please let me know. As you all know, you have the option of rewriting paper number 1, and my comment should give you some direction on how to proceed, but you can always contact me as well if you need further guidance. That will be due at the ending of the semester, which is actually coming right upon us, believe it or not. I just ask that you submit in your revision along with the graded original so that I can compare the two. In terms of where we are in the semester, I decided to give you a little bit of extra time to write the paper because I know how condensed the summer session is, which means that we're going to have to move a little bit more quickly. But the good news is that after Jane Eyre, the reading load lightens considerably. And journal number 3 for Jane Eyre would be due for today, the 29th, Tuesday, at 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email. Which is ruiz@gcc.mass.edu. And as always, if you need an extension, please let me know. But you want to start submitting things in sooner rather than later because our semester ends on the 8th of July. And that's the second part of the notes underneath this video. You can see our course outline, where today we are finishing Jane Eyre. I also wanted to talk a little bit about Emily Dickinson and have you watch an Emily Dickinson documentary. And then on the 1st of July, which is Thursday of this week, we will finish up with Emily Dickinson and begin Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And then on the 6th of July, we will finish Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And we will also talk about The Awakening, which is our very last text, a novella by Kay Chopin. And then our final exam is on the 8th, which is a Thursday. And that's where your second paper will be due with one of the later works in the semester. My thinking being either Jane Eyre or Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl or The Awakening. Dickinson is also another possibility, but just like writing about a short story, like the story of an hour, it's a very different kind of exercise writing about a poem than writing about, let's say, a novel. But that said, if you wanted to write on Dickinson, you can try out some of your ideas with me. What I was going to do with Dickinson is have you watch this documentary, and then next class we'll talk a little bit about Dickinson, and next class the attendance question will be asking you to find a Dickinson poem out of her many poems, and to basically talk a little bit about why that particular poem is one that you wanted to share. It doesn't have to be a poem that you understand. It just has to be a poem that speaks to you in one way or another. And in that way, we'll have at least a handful of Dickinson poems that we will have covered in class if each of you select a different Dickinson poem. And I'm assuming that that's probably what will happen. There might be a little bit of duplication, but odds are with 1,000+ poems that it's pretty certain that we will at least have several Dickinson poems in the attendance question. So in relation to Jane Eyre, I gave you a BBC version of the film, not that that is, or a BBC version of the novel, not that a film is in any way a substitute for reading the novel, but I'm quite aware that it's a long novel, and I've often suggested that the best way to deal with Jane Eyre is to think about it as separate texts. It's a much more manageable way of thinking about Jane Eyre, and that's how I had approached it the last time we talked about Jane Eyre, that text 1, if you will, and this would be Jane when she's at Gateshead, is one story in and of itself, and then we move to Jane being in Lowood, and then that's another story in and of itself, and both of these are about Jane's childhood. And then we move to where we are now, which is the bulk of the text, and that's Jane at Thornfield. And that's where ultimately we've got the love story, which is one of the main attractions of Jane Eyre. But one of the reasons why I like Jane Eyre is because it's such a modern text. What we have is a very strong female in a time period when, as we know from the Cult of True Womanhood, there were few opportunities for women to have agency and voice. So while we've seen some strength with, let's say, an Anne Elliot in Persuasion, and we've seen what happens when women are excluded from the lives of males in Frankenstein, we have yet to see a female who basically is such a champion for herself, especially in a world where she's deemed as poor, where she's deemed as ugly, and where she's deemed as weak. And where we left off is that we have this mystery, because part of the appeal of Jane Eyre as well is that there are many Gothic elements that are associated with Jane Eyre. So if you happen to like the Gothic, which I do, it's one of the reasons why I teach Gothic literature, and a class that I'm teaching this fall, is because it sets the atmosphere and the mood, and we saw that right from the very beginning with reference to the Red Room when Jane was a little girl, and then also with the idea of Jane being in Thornfield and this mysterious laugh and these dark corridors, and obviously a place with secrets. So where we are now is in chapter 19 with Jane Eyre. And this is where Rochester decides to have a little bit of fun with Jane. You might say he's also being cruel with Jane, but he is going to be experiencing some justice for his, or some retribution for the way that he's gone about his pursuit of Jane. But he basically pretends to be a seer and our gypsy fortune teller, and this is oftentimes deleted from some of the movie versions because it can be deleted and it doesn't necessarily sacrifice plot, but I think it says a great deal about Rochester and his arrogance as well as his sense of mischievousness, and it also says a great deal about Jane Eyre's strength. And as the gypsy fortune teller, Rochester is pretending to be and tells Jane, "You are cold because you are alone. No contact strikes the fire from you that is in you. You are sick because the best of feelings, the highest and the sweetest to man, keeps far away from you. You are silly because, suffer as you may, you will not beckon it to approach, nor will you stir one step to meet it where it waits you," says the gypsy woman to Jane. Jane's brow professes to say, "I can live alone if self-respect and the circumstance requires me to do so. I have an inward treasure born of me, which can keep me alive if all extraneous delight should be withheld, or offered only at a price I cannot afford to give." Of course, this is a bit of foreshadowing because this is exactly what's going to be happening when Jane finally learns Rochester's secret, that he's already married to someone else. So while he offers her the opportunity to be his mistress, she realizes that it's immoral. And despite her strong love for him, she can't sacrifice her morals, even if that means that they're both going to suffer. So Jane has a much higher character than Rochester does, at least at this point in the novel, even though Rochester has status and even though Rochester has money. And then in chapter 20, we see how Jane nurses Mr. Mason. Again, that reminds you of the Cult of True Womanhood and how oftentimes female role was that of nurse or caretaker. And she says to Rochester, "If anyone you know has suffered and erred, let him look higher than his equals for strength to amend and solace to heal." And again, this is going to be a little bit of foreshadowing as well when we learn the truth about Rochester. Chapter 21 is where Jane is actually going to be going back to Gateshead. So she's going to be, as an adult, visiting Gateshead and seeing what happened to the Reed family. John Reed has died, supposedly through a suicide because he had debt and because he lived a rather lavish lifestyle. And when Jane returns to Gateshead, she finds out that her two cousins have gone in completely opposite directions. Georgiana has become a spoiled, arrogant woman looking to marry a rich suitor. Think Persuasion, if you will. And Eliza has been the other extreme, a cold, distant religious woman planning to join the nunnery. One of the interesting things about Jane Eyre is the commentary on religion, and that religion is oftentimes filled with extremism and hypocrisy. Again, very bold statement to be making at any time, but especially during the time period in which this novel was written. Mrs. Reed is an old dying woman, and she refuses to accept Jane's reconciliation. Again, what we see is that Jane has a depth of character and a depth of morality that others around her do not. And while Jane is willing to forgive, Mrs. Reed is unable to. Mrs. Reed also reveals a letter indicating that Jane has family. So part of this novel is a mystery story, and we're unraveling the clues. And I think it's one of the reasons why Jane Eyre is such a favorite piece of so many people, because it touches on so many different genres. It can be gothic, it can be mystery, it can be love story, it could be social commentary. In fact, it's all of those at once. So Mrs. Reed reveals a letter that Jane does have family, some sort of a distant uncle, looking to adopt Jane. But of course, Jane returns back, and that becomes the last thing on her mind when she is proposed to by Rochester. He is smoking a cigar, and this is in chapter 23. A lot has been made of that. If you know anything about Freudian psychology, then you probably know how the cigar is oftentimes viewed as a phallic symbol. And in this text, we have this sense of eroticism that we have not yet really seen. It might have been slightly suggested in Persuasion, but there is more of a sense of the physicality of love in Jane Eyre than in anything we've read thus far. Rochester proposes to Jane while smoking a cigar, admitting he's trying to make her jealous. And lightning strikes, and you might say that, you can think about that as a kind of foreshadowing, while it splits the chestnut tree. The idea that something negative is going to be happening and something that's alive that will be killed. There is this idea of doubling as well, which you also see in the Gothic, and we'll find that out when Jane finally meets her counterpart, which happens to be Rochester's first wife, Bertha Mason. So you could say that we also talk about how lightning strikes, and we use that in the positive in the sense that Rochester has now been able to admit his love for Jane, and Jane has been able to admit her love for him. So now it appears that we are going to have a happy ending, but the book isn't anywhere nearly done, so obviously there's much more story. In chapter 24, we again see Rochester's arrogance and self-centeredness, even though he is perhaps smart enough to know that he is not necessarily going to want to marry someone like a Blanche Ingram, who is spoiled and self-centered. But what he does want is for Jane to be in silks and pearls. And that's something that Jane refuses. And she keeps Rochester at bay in chapter 24, stating, I won't be your English Celine Varens. I shall continue to act as Adele's governess. By that I shall earn my board and lodging, and you shall give me nothing. And she does this to keep him in reasonable check. So there's some interesting things going on here. The foreshadowing that she won't be his mistress. The second, that she's going to continue her profession and continue to earn her own income, because that means independence. Again, remember during this time period that one of the criteria for being a teacher is that one were single. Once a female married, it was assumed that she would give up her position, which is exactly what we saw with Miss Temple when Jane was at Lowood. And she talks also about keeping him in reasonable check. Up until this point, Rochester has been in control of Jane. Now we see how Jane turns the table, so to speak, and now she is talking about how she can control Rochester, or how female can control male, and not necessarily by being passive, but by being a worthy adversary, in effect, by being an equal. And then in chapter 25, Jane has disturbing dreams. There's lots of premonitions that are going on here, and lots of elements that are related to the subconscious. And her wedding veil is ripped in two. Again, we get that idea of the twos or the doubles that we are going to see when she finds ultimately Bertha Mason. The big reveal is in chapter 26, that Mr. Rochester is still married to Mr. Mason's mad sister Bertha, and has been hidden by Grace Poole. So Grace Poole is not the adversary. It's hidden by Grace Poole in Thornfield. And that's probably the biggest thorn that occurs, if you want to think about Thornfield as being a symbol, with the field being positive and a thorn being negative, a thorn being able to hurt or to bring pain if you're pricked. And this mad sister has something that oftentimes is viewed as a commentary on female during the time period. That this unrestrained passion, which Bertha represents, is classified as madness, and it was easily dismissed. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the awakening, so keep that in mind. And if you are interested in learning her story, if you've ever heard of a text by Jean Rhys, that's Rhys, called Wide Sargasso Sea, then what we have is a fictional account of Bertha Mason in her early days when she was being courted. Because we get very little of her story, and her story is quite fascinating. And we can see this in two ways: that Rochester has done the honorable thing because he continues to care for her, or that Rochester has been completely dishonorable because he basically has kept her away from society and humanity. So we see that Rochester is a rather complex character, very much the Byronic hero, kind of dark and broody with a negative side to him, and needing to be taught a certain level of humility. At any rate, we find out that Grace Poole has been hiding Bertha Mason, and we find out why Rochester married her, because his father wanted to make sure that he had a good match, because Bertha Mason had a certain amount of income. And that was something that Rochester didn't have, because his eldest brother had all of the income. And again, all of this makes so much more sense in the context of Persuasion, where we were talking about the importance of title and the importance of money. It's one of the reasons why I wanted us to read Persuasion. Now, in chapter 27, Jane is quite tempted to take Rochester's offer that they could go live off happily forever. And Jane thinks to herself, "None shall help you. You shall yourself pluck out your right eye, yourself cut off your right hand." This is going to be a little bit of foreshadowing of what happens to Rochester at the end. And resist the temptation of becoming Rochester's mistress. In other words, that Jane too is subject to sin and frailty, but she has also strength to overcome. And she tells Rochester, "Do as I do. Trust in God and yourself. Believe in heaven. Hope to meet again there." And she thinks, "I care for myself. The more solitary, the more friendless, the more unsustained I am, the more I will respect myself." And again, very contemporary kind of sentiment. In chapter 28, Jane flees, and we know that she's going off to try to escape from Rochester and to be independent. She ends up basically being destitute because Jane also has some lessons to learn, and she flees into nature, the universal mother. Think about how we talked about nature as female when we were talking about Frankenstein. And that this universal mother, note that Jane is motherless, much like Anne Elliot was motherless, much like Victor Frankenstein after his mother died was motherless. Jane flees into nature, the universal mother, who is benign and good. And again, this idea that it's almost in some ways Shakespearean when we think about King Lear running into the wilderness and nature, if you are familiar with King Lear. Jane suffers the physical and the emotional pain of being a beggar at this point. Before she finally is rescued, we have to suspend a little bit of disbelief here, by a chapter pastor who happens to be named Rivers. And she ends up learning about his family, his two sisters, Mary and Diana. And this is at Marsh End. And if you want to think about the symbolism of titles, Marsh End, the ending of the marsh, or the ending of pain, or the ending of suffering, or the ending of something negative, or more house. In other words, this is a house where Jane will be finding more, which is exactly what happens. Jane basically is in a horrible state and awakens 3 days later. And we can say that this is a kind of physical and spiritual rebirth. If you're familiar with Christianity and the importance of Trinity and three, it took Jesus 3 days to rise from the dead, for instance. And this is where Jane tells the housekeeper that poverty is not a crime. So Jane has learned a great deal. If we think about the early days of Jane Eyre, when she was a little girl and she thought she would never want to be poor. And now we see as an adult that she's had to suffer poverty and that that's not a crime. And she teaches the housekeeper that. Jane bonds very much with Mary and Diana, and St. John offers Jane a very humble job of teaching poor children. Keep in mind the contrast between that and a governess in a very rich house. And Jane accepts. Again, Jane also needs to learn a certain level of humility. And then the Rivers family learns that their long-lost Uncle John has died and has not left them an inheritance. So again, if you like mystery stories, perhaps you're starting to put together the pieces. Now, in chapter 31, Jane admits that she felt degraded by the ignorance and the poverty and the coarseness of her pupils. So the first thing we can say here is Jane is honest. And secondly, we can say that too, Jane has flaws, but Jane acknowledges them as well. And basically she says she knows these feelings are wrong and shall strive to overcome them. And St. John struggles against his attraction to a rich and vivacious Miss Oliver because he wants to devote his life to religion. Again, this is a very cold, hard view of religion, something that we saw with Jane's cousin, and also something that was illustrated with Brocklehurst, though Brocklehurst's religion was more hypocritical. What we've got with the St. John's religion is that it's more callous. Both are negative as portrayed in this particular text. That Miss Oliver is filled with too much life and too much enjoyment, and St. John wants to live a life of deprivation and pain. And it's something that Jane could never do. Keep in mind when Jane was at Lowood and Helen Burns died, again, looking forward to the afterlife. But Jane had too much appreciation for the world, this life, for the physicality of joy, to die or to be like a St. John, as we will see when he tries to get her to accompany him to be as his wife. Not because he loves her, but because he thinks that this will serve God's plan and they could be missionaries together. In chapter 33, another big reveal, which you may have anticipated, St. John learns that Jane Elliot, interesting that she took the surname Elliot since we just finished reading Persuasion about the Elliot family. But that's just coincidental, that Jane Elliot is really a Jane Eyre who is being searched for by Mr. Rochester, and he's been basically searching for her frantically since she left. Of course, what we find out also is that St. John, Mary, and Diana Rivers are Jane's cousins, and their Uncle John, a rich bachelor, basically left his inheritance to Jane. So if you think about the title, I talked a little bit about the significance of the name Jane in the title last class, but I didn't want to talk about the significance of her last name, Eyre. But as you can see, Eyre, E-Y-R-E, is pronounced the same way as heir, H-E-I-R. In other words, Jane is the heir to the fortune. So that's the significance of the title. And he does so in revenge against the Rivers' mother, his sister, who married a poor clergyman. Again, illustrating the importance of making good matches. And then Jane realizes that this is completely unjust and unfair. This is very much a novel that rallies against and rails against injustice on all levels. And Jane joyfully shares her fortune with her cousins, that would be the fair thing to do. She's quite wealthy. We're talking about millions at this point, so she can easily share. St. John proposes to Jane that she become a missionary's wife to him in India to serve God, but Jane refuses, in part because there is no real love, and in part too because her heart still belongs with Rochester, even though she believes that she can no longer be with Rochester because ultimately he is still married. This is where we get more of the Gothic elements of the text, and perhaps this cannot be explained away in the way that some of the other episodes can be. And in chapter 35, Jane hears Rochester's voice from afar calling her. And what we find out later is that Rochester heard Jane as well. So there really is no explanation for that in the way that we can explain perhaps the mysterious laugh in Thornfield or the vision in the Red Room. Jane returns to Thornfield, and this is where she learns that it has been ravaged by fire. Again, the lightning strike that I was talking about earlier might have been foreshadowing of that. And she learns that Rochester died in trying to save his wife. So this is where he becomes a hero. And he is now maimed and blind. And this is perhaps a suitable sense of justice for him because he has been blind throughout the entire novel, if you want to think about it that way, with his arrogance and his pretension. Rochester now resides in Ferndene. If you think about something like a fern, which is something that's lush and full of life, and that would be the last part of Jane Eyre, if you will. So if the first book happens to be about Jane's youth in Gateshead, and then moving to Jane as a teenager in school in Lowood, and then finally Jane as a woman, albeit a very young woman, but a woman nonetheless, in Thornfield. Those are 3 books. The 4th book would basically be Jane at Marsh End or Moor House. And then finally, the 5th and last book would be at Ferndene, which is a short book, and this is where we get our happy ending, where we find out that Jane now is independent, financially independent, so now she can meet Rochester as an equal. Rochester has been humbled, and now that he's maimed and blinded, so he needs Jane as much as Jane needs him. He probably needs Jane more. And they unite, where Rochester talks about that he's been able to find God, and not the hypocritical God that oftentimes is highlighted in Jane Eyre, or the cold, callous God that's highlighted in Jane Eyre, but the merciful God. And then finally we get our happy ending in chapter 37, where they've been married 10 years at this particular point. Jane and Rochester, they're soulmates in effect, and he's had a return of some of his vision. If you are familiar with Oedipus the King, then you are Oedipus, or Sophocles' play, Oedipus the King, then a BC play from Greek society. Then you are familiar with Oedipus, who blinds himself at the end of the play because he has lacked insight. And then you're also familiar in the play that there happens to be a blind prophet, Tiresias. He has no vision, but he has insight. And this is a comparable idea with Rochester. Obviously, the Brontes knew their literature and could give nods to things like Oedipus the King or King Lear in writing, and definitely that's what we see in this particular novel. Lots of themes in this novel. I think some of the most interesting ones are gender. Definitely we can talk about the idea of female during the time period, and Jane being a very exceptional both girl and also woman. We can also talk about class. Up until this point we really haven't seen any kind of economic struggles, but as poverty-stricken as Jane is, this will be nothing in comparison to something like Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which we will be coming to next. Religion, and very critical of most religions, and this reminds me a little bit of Emily Dickinson and her true life story, as you will see in the documentary that I'm asking you to watch. Normally I would have not necessarily done both in one class, but again I thought it would behoove all of us to give you a little bit of extra time to finish your first paper, so I'm putting both of these together, Jane Eyre and also some Dickinson. The idea of hypocrisy and how Jane critiques that hypocrisy, whether it be for hypocrisy because of social convention, hypocrisy in terms of religion, and then finally the importance of honor and dignity and self-respect. And that, I think, is what makes Jane Eyre such a favorite of so many readers, is because it really is a champion of the importance of being honorable and dignified. So in terms of today's attendance question, because Jane Eyre has so many lovely quotes, and I've been identifying some of them thus far, I thought I could ask you to identify one quote that you find to be particularly compelling in Jane Eyre and briefly indicate why. That'll be due on Wednesday at 9 a.m. on our discussion forum. Meanwhile, I'd like you also to watch a documentary. It's entitled Voices and Visions, Emily Dickinson. And it happens to give a sense of not only Emily Dickinson's biography, but it does a good amount of quoting from some of her poetry as well, so that you can get a sense of some of the style of her writing. So I'm asking you to watch this documentary because this will help inform our conversation next class about Emily Dickinson. So I hope you're doing well, and I hope you're staying cool too. And I'm doing well and also doing my best to stay cool. And we will continue on next class talking about Emily Dickinson. We will also begin Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which you will find in terms of the length and the difficulty of, or the complexity, I suppose, of language. It's going to be a much easier read. That said, it is a difficult read in that it is very brutal and horrific in terms of thinking about that it's not only detailing slavery, but it's a true story. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. So again, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.